Welcome back to the deep dive. If you've ever found yourself scrolling through fringe history sites late at night, well, you have absolutely encountered the legend we are tackling
Oh, no,
today.
definitely. It's almost unavoidable.
We are strapping in for an intellectual adventure that promises to rewrite human history, or at least that's exactly what its creators wanted you to believe. We are talking about the mother of all persistent pseudo-archaeological mysteries, the Dropa Stones.
It truly is a spectacular story, and it endures. It's got all the perfect ingredients, really, for a self-sustaining modern myth.
Yeah.
You've got ancient artifacts, undecipherable hieroglyphs, a lonely, suppressed professor,
Right.
and the tantalizing possibility of alien crash survivors stranded on Earth, 12,000 years ago?
And that dual nature, the myth versus the reality, that's our mission today. We are going to first fully immerse ourselves in the captivating, dramatic narrative of the Dropa Stones, savoring every twist and, alleged piece of proof. But then we pivot. We perform a rigorous, almost journalistic investigation to trace this powerful story back, not to some ancient crash site in the mountains of China, but to its true, wondrously absurd origins in mid-20th century magazines.
Yeah, and when we examine the Dropa narrative, what we're really looking at is a sociological puzzle, not an archaeological one. It's a masterpiece of hoax construction, perhaps accidental at first, but it's engineered to be self-proving.
How so?
Well, its architecture is designed, brilliantly actually, to make the absence of evidence feel like the strongest form of proof.
Ah, the classic conspiracy move.
Exactly. That's why its deconstruction, peeling back those layers, is ultimately more fascinating than the legend itself.
Okay, let's unpack this epic legend then, as it is usually told. Let's start with the captivating narrative of the discovery, allegedly back in 1938. What's the essential setting for this supposedly world-changing event?
Right, the setting is critical because it immediately establishes the story in this realm of mystery and inaccessibility, where secrets can hide unchallenged. The alleged location is the extremely remote and rugged Bayan-Karaula Mountains.
Okay.
It's a system that sits right on the border between China and Tibet. This area itself, being highly remote, politically sensitive sometimes, it just suggests a place where lost histories could easily remain hidden from the modern academic world.
Makes sense. And the timing, though, we'll find the exact date is a bit fluid. It centers around 1938, where sometimes you see 1937 mentioned. Who was the heroic figure who supposedly led this expedition?
The central figure in the Dropa lore is the Chinese archaeologist named Chi Pu-Tai. His name is sometimes modernized as Qi Fu-Tai in later accounts, probably trying to give the story a veneer of authenticity.
Okay, Chi Pu-Tai.
And his team was allegedly conducting a detailed survey of a series of complex, interlinking caves deep within this mountainous region.
And the narrative suggests these caves weren't just, standard natural formations. That adds to the intrigue right away.
Exactly. They're described in the lore as being architecturally remarkable. The most sensational accounts suggest these caves were not natural at all.
Really?
Yeah, claiming they had been carved using a technically advanced cutter, implying sophisticated technology far beyond what humans should have possessed 12,000 years ago.
Wow, okay.
Other, maybe slightly tamer versions of the story simply describe them as an extensive network of highly unusual, hand-carved tunnels. Either way, the setting signals immediately that this isn't just a geological site, but a site of ancient, intentional, and maybe advanced intervention.
So after navigating these remarkable tunnels, what were the first stunning finds reported? We moved to the alleged Cave of the Skeletons.
Right, the expedition allegedly made two massive finds, and the first involves human remains, or maybe we should clarify hominoid remains.
Oh.
They found a series of neatly arranged graves,
Neatly arranged.
which immediately suggests deliberate, organized, and respectful burial practices, indicating culture and intelligence.
Okay, and the remains themselves were definitely not those of ordinary Homo sapiens, according to the story.
Far from it. The skeletons were described as belonging to a unique hominoid species.
Yeah.
The physical description is uncannily specific, almost like a medical profile you'd read. They possessed spindly bodies, elongated, disproportionate limbs, and, most distinctly, large, overdeveloped heads.
Wait a second. If this discovery was truly made in 1938, that physical description, spindly body, large head, it sounds like a textbook, almost cliché description of what we now call a gray alien. That archetype didn't really exist culturally back then, did it?
You've hit on the immediate, major narrative inconsistency right there. The reported size reinforces this image, too. The skeletons were just over 1 meter tall, so roughly 4 feet.
Tiny.
Now, the story claims that Chi Pu-Tai team initially considered the remains might be an unknown species of ape. But they supposedly dismissed that idea pretty quickly because of the burial context.
Because apes don't usually bury their dead in neat graves.
Exactly. The lore stresses that finding a species that seemed to bury its dead is a cultural practice not typically associated with apes.
But let's go back to that physical description, because this really feels like the first major red flag of the hoax. If an archaeologist genuinely found remains like that in 1938, how would they have categorized them without the language of ufology that developed much later?
They wouldn't have used that language because, like you said, it didn't exist yet. They probably would have talked about unknown primates, maybe some link to Neanderthals, or perhaps an unknown indigenous human population with significant skeletal abnormalities, or maybe some kind of dwarfism.
Right, something explainable within the science of the time.
Precisely. The specific characteristics, the spindly body, the large, bald, domed head, that is the signature image of the gray alien, popularized by abduction stories in media in the 1950s and 60s. The fact that the discovery narrative, supposedly from 1938, perfectly describes a sci-fi trope from 2 decades later, well, it's a very strong indicator that the discovery story was written, or at least heavily edited, much later. Retrofitted, basically.
It's just impossible for an event to perfectly match a future cultural idea like that. It screams fabrication. But the expedition didn't just find bones, they also supposedly found art on the walls of these sophisticated caves.
That's right. The cave walls were reportedly decorated with complex pictographs. These drawings depicted the sun, the moon, the earth, and the stars. And critically, these celestial bodies weren't just scattered randomly. They were connected by lines composed of pea-sized dots.
Which immediately suggests what? A map. Some kind of navigational chart, maybe, or a record of intercelestial travel.
That is precisely the narrative implication the story wants you to draw. The art also included figures, sometimes described as stick figures with elongated heads, or, in other accounts, as figures with round helmets, depending on which version of the story you happen to read.
So the whole atmosphere of the cave, these advanced tunnels, the small-statured, large-headed beings buried respectfully, and the star maps, it all combines perfectly to set the stage for an alien crash narrative.
It's a very compelling setup.
Absolutely. Now we pivot, because the real stars of the show are what we call the 7 and 16 speaking grooves. This is the discovery that truly launched the Dropa legend into the stratosphere.
Yes, absolutely. The second and far more famous discovery occurred when a member of Chiputai's team allegedly stumbled upon a large circular stone disc half buried in the cave floor. It was instantly described, even in the subsequent lore, as resembling a Stone Age record.
A Stone Age record, like an LP.
Exactly, or an ancient long playing record. That comparison is made explicit in many tellings.
And this wasn't just one isolated curiosity. The sheer scale of the alleged find gave it weight.
Indeed. According to the Dropa legend, the team eventually recovered a total of 716 such discs.
716.
Which is a massive number. It suggests a complete, comprehensive, highly organized library of records, not just a single chance artifact. The sheer volume makes the claim feel much more serious, much more substantial.
Let's detail the physical characteristics of these Dropa stones because they sound incredibly specific in the accounts.
They were described as being quite substantial, up to 1 foot or about 30 centimeters in diameter. And they all featured a distinctive hole in the center.
Like a record.
Just like a record. But the critical defining detail was the marking. They didn't have ordinary lines or symbols. They featured a fine spiral groove. This groove formed a double spiral pattern, spiraling continuously from the central hole right out to the outer rim, and then supposedly back in again.
Like a vinyl record that could play endlessly, or at least for a very long time.
Precisely the image. It literally matched the physical structure of mid-century media technology.
And the content of that groove, that was the real bombshell, right?
That was the key. This groove was allegedly not decorative, but was a continuous spiraling line of closely written characters, described as tiny hieroglyph-like markings. The source material notes these were so fine they were visible only with a magnifying glass.
Wow.
These markings were dubbed the speaking grooves, suggesting they contained a detailed, perhaps even audible record of the events of the distant past.
And this detail delivers the second major anachronism, just as definitive as the alien body descriptions, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. The concept of a Stone Age record is a massive chronological contradiction. It's a perfect instance of cultural projection. The people creating or relaying this story in the mid-20th century were looking at the idea of an ancient communications artifact and describing it using the single most dominant media technology of their own era, the vinyl LP. This is a crucial sign that the story was not recorded in 1938, but invented significantly later, when that specific technological form was ubiquitous in their own lives.
The idea that a 12,000-year-old alien species would just happen to use a recording medium designed in the 1940s is, well, it's beyond convenient. It's absurd.
It strains credulity past the breaking point.
Yeah.
It's like discovering an ancient Egyptian scroll that somehow contains perfectly functional QR codes. The medium reflects the inventor's time, not the supposed creator's.
We also have to acknowledge the serious internal inconsistencies that pop up even within the legend's telling of the discovery itself. If the story is true, why is the narrative so wobbly on the details?
That instability is actually characteristic of folklore and myth-making. Since there are no original official records to reference, as we'll see, different tellers fill in the gaps differently or maybe change details to make it sound better.
Like what?
For instance, some sources claim the discovery was 1937, not 1938. That's a small detail, maybe. But even more damagingly, there are conflicting accounts about the discs themselves. Some versions say Chipute recovered all 716 discs right there in 1938.
Okay.
Others claim only one single disc was recovered initially, and it was studied for 20 years before the other 715 were somehow found or acknowledged later.
That's a huge difference.
It's a fundamental difference in the core event. These fluid details really prove the myth is being actively adapted and reshaped by its advocates over time, not recounted from a stable historical record.
So, okay, we have the remote setting, the strange bones, the star maps, and these 716 stone LPs. Now we move into the next critical part of the legend, the translation, the suppression, and the necessary invention of the martyred prophet figure. After 1938, the discs were allegedly just stored for decades. Where were they, and why the long delay in figuring them out?
Right. According to the story, they were essentially treated as geological oddities or curiosities. They were labeled and stored for 2 decades, often placed in storage, perhaps at Beijing University, or sometimes the Academy of Prehistory is mentioned.
Okay.
The core reason given for the delay within the narrative itself is failure. Many experts reportedly tried to decipher these speaking grooves, but failed completely. It was deemed a language or a script unlike anything known on Earth.
Which conveniently sets the stage perfectly for the necessary genius, the one man who could achieve the breakthrough, Professor Sumi Nui.
Yes. The lone genius trope. The discs were allegedly handed over to him either around 1958 or perhaps the early 1960s. The story is usually quite meticulous about giving him an official-sounding title and institutional backing. He's often identified as working at the Beijing Academy for Ancient Studies, or the Academy of Prehistory in Beijing.
That institutional setting is key, isn't it? It lends a veneer of official, high-level scientific rigor to a story that, up to this point, relies mostly on speculation and weird findings.
Absolutely. It grounds the fantastic claim in a seemingly verifiable academic context.
And by 1962, Nui allegedly cracked the code. What earth-shattering message did the translation supposedly reveal to the world?
The translation revealed essentially a foundational charter myth for the entire ancient astronaut theory. It was the story of an extraterrestrial space probe that had suffered catastrophic damage and crash-landed precisely 12,000 years ago in those very Karagula Mountains.
Wow.
The occupants of this downed craft called themselves the Dropas, and their vehicle was damaged beyond any hope of repair, leaving them stranded on Earth.
So, they were completely stranded, left at the mercy of the locals. And the discs allegedly provided an intimate first-hand account of this disastrous first contact situation. We even have a supposed direct quote from the translated script, don't we?
We do, and it's very dramatic, clearly designed to evoke pathos. The narrative gives us a specific piece of text, which is framed as an observation from the scared local population. The Dropa came down from the clouds in their aircraft. Our men, women, and children hid in the caves 10 times before sunrise. When at last we understood the sign language of the Dropas, we realized that the newcomers had peaceful intentions.
Okay, so the implication is that the Dropas were peaceful, advanced, just unfortunate survivors. But the story immediately turns tragic, detailing a conflict with the local tribes.
Right. The tragedy is fueled entirely by misunderstanding and prejudice, according to the tale. The local population, variously called the Ham tribe or the Han tribe in different accounts, misinterpreted the strange, small, large-headed survivors. They supposedly described them as so ugly they are perceived as evil dwarfs or malevolent spirits dropping from the sky.
And the outcome?
The outcome, according to the discs, was brutal and swift. Many of the crashed Dropas were immediately hunted down and killed by the frightened local population. It serves as this horrific cautionary tale of alien-human first contact gone catastrophically wrong.
Now, for the final, absolutely crucial structural twist in the legend, the cover-up and the exile of the hero, Professor Sum, Nui. This part is essential for the story's longevity, isn't it?
It's the ingenious engine that really powers the hoax and keeps it going. Once some Nui published his findings, or tried to, the Peking Academy of Prehistory allegedly forbade him from publishing any further results.
Ah, the suppression begins.
Exactly. When published anyway, supposedly in some obscure academic journal, he was immediately met with ridicule by the mainstream scientific community and branded a liar by his superiors.
He's deliberately cast as the academic martyr, the lone truth-teller silenced by the dogmatic establishment.
Absolutely. The narrative describes him as a hero professor, forced to resign in disgrace. The story ensures his legacy is tainted but noble, concluding with him fleeing China for Japan in self-imposed exile, where he supposedly died shortly after completing his final manuscript documenting the translation.
We really need to pause here and fully appreciate the function of this martyred prophet trope. It's not just a sad ending, it's actually a brilliant strategic move for ensuring the hoax endures.
It is the ultimate defense mechanism against debunking. This narrative structure, where a hero uncovers a paradigm-shifting truth, is systematically suppressed by authorities, ridiculed by dogmatic peers, and then dies or vanishes in exile. It serves to preemptively frame the total and inevitable absence of any real evidence as positive proof of a successful conspiracy.
So if you, the skeptical researcher, go looking for Professor Sum, Nui's official paper or his university records or his field notes or even his death certificate, and you find absolutely nothing, the legend immediately tells you, see, the conspiracy worked perfectly. The establishment wiped the slate clean. The genius of the lie, structurally, is that it renders itself effectively undebunkable in the eyes of believers, because every challenge to the story, every lack of proof, simply reinforces the core narrative of suppression.
It shifts the burden of proof entirely onto the skeptic and away from the claimant. The translation thus becomes this self-fulfilling, unassailable charter myth for the ancient astronaut theory. It's quite brilliant in a way.
You say so.
That structural analysis moves us directly to the true deep dive. It's time to stop believing the story and start tracking where and how the story itself was actually created. We're moving into the forensic investigation of the hoax's provenance.
Yeah.
The true literary genesis.
Right, and this is the critical reveal that changes everything. The Dropa Stones are definitively not a suppressed historical or archaeological event. They are a documented pseudo-archaeological hoax, and their true origins are firmly rooted not in a 1938 expedition, but in sensationalist 1960s print media. Okay, let's track the paper trail. Even before the famous supposed 1962 translation by Sum. Nui, what were the initial conceptual seeds of this type of story circulating? Was the idea already out there?
Yes, the general theme, that is, speculating about ancient astronaut theories, was certainly in the air. The earliest identifiable source for that general theme was an article published in the Russian publication Literaturanaya Gazeta back on February 9th, 1960.
Okay.
It was written by V. Rich and M. Chernenko. Now, this is important. The intellectual climate for ancient astronauts is already bubbling up, particularly in Soviet media, but this article did not mention the Dropa Stones specifically.
But it predates the alleged translation.
Crucially, yes, it predates the alleged 1962 translation by Sum. Nui, proving the general idea was circulating before the specific artifacts and story were invented.
But the complete, fully formed Dropa narrative with cheaper tie, the 716 discs, Sum, Nui's 1962 translation, the 12,000-year crash, where did that specific detailed structure first appear in print?
We can trace the entire fiction, pretty much element for element, back to a single article published in the July 1962 issue of Das Vegetarische Universum.
Wait, the vegetarian universe? I have to admit, that is probably the most wonderfully absurd place for the foundation of a major pillar of modern ufology to be discovered.
That's a German fringe magazine, right? Not exactly a peer-reviewed scientific publication.
No, not quite the hallowed halls of the Beijing Academy for Ancient Studies. It was a German fringe magazine dedicated primarily to, well, vegetarianism and holistic living, which also frequently dabbled in the esoteric and pseudoscientific. The article itself was titled UFOs in der Vorzeit, which simply translates as UFOs in prehistory.
And the attribution for this earth-shattering revelation, the complete blueprint of the Dropa myth as we know it? was that equally flimsy.
Oh, absolutely dubious. The article was attributed to a non-existent person named Reinhard Wageman, and to add a little fake sense of officialdom to a non-existent DNA news agency supposedly operating out of Tokyo.
Non-existent. Completely. Extensive, serious journalistic inquiries over the years have confirmed there is simply no record of any Reinhard Wageman connected to this, nor any news agency named DNA operating in Tokyo that correlates with this period. The source cited was itself a fiction within a fiction.
Okay, this detail provides the ultimate timeline inversion that definitively destroys the legend as it's commonly told. We need to state this inversion as clearly as possible for everyone listening.
Yes, we absolutely must emphasize this point. The 1962 article in Das Vegetalis Universum is not a journalistic report commenting on Professor Tsum. Newey's 1962 translation breakthrough, that is what the proponents of the story want you to believe.
Right.
In reality, the 1962 article is the precise moment of the invention of Professor Tsum. Newey, Chiputai, the 716 desks, and the translation narrative. The translation is a fictional event created entirely within the framework of this fictional article published in a German vegetarian fringe magazine.
So, the myth wasn't suppressed. It was simply printed in an obscure, non-credible publication in Germany and largely ignored initially. But the story didn't die there. It gained credibility through a deliberate process that researchers often refer to as story laundering. Let's move to tracing how this fiction managed to gain a powerful, if undeserved, scientific veneer.
Right. The process began with republication. The story was apparently reprinted a couple of years later in 1964 in another niche German UFO magazine. But its real jump in perceived credibility, the main laundry cycle, if you will, came when it was picked up and republished in the Soviet magazine Sputnik.
Sputnik, when was that?
Sometime between 1966 and 1968, the exact date varies in sources.
Now, Sputnik was a Soviet state publication, often sensationalist, but it had a certain air of official scientific backing in the West during the Cold War, which must have given the story a massive credibility boost it didn't have before.
Precisely. And the author of that Sputnik piece, Vyacheslav Zaitsev, didn't just translate the story from the German vegetarian article. He added the critical layer of supposed scientific detail. He embellished it significantly.
This is the laundering part. He infused it with official-sounding scientific details, giving the story a technical layer it completely lacked before.
That is the core of the laundering process. Zaitsev didn't just report the myth. He claimed that several of the discs had actually been shipped all the way to Moscow for sophisticated analysis by Soviet scientists. This implies state-level interest and scientific rigor.
And what were these alleged official findings from Moscow? We need the technical jargon here, the stuff that suddenly made the hoax sound real and credible to a wider audience.
Okay, so Zaitsev claimed that the discs, which he specified were made of granite, contained high concentrations of cobalt and other exotic metals. Furthermore, he claimed they exhibited unusual electrical properties.
Electrical properties in granite discs.
Yes. Specifically, the discs allegedly behaved as electrical conductors, which granite does not. And when placed on a special turntable for testing, they supposedly produced a humming sound or a surprising oscillation rhythm as if they had been electrically charged by some long-lost alien energy source.
Okay, that sequence going from a fictional narrative in the vegetarian universe attributed to fake people to being filtered through an official-sounding Soviet state publication that injects technical-sounding but scientifically nonsensical jargon like cobalt, electrical conductors, and oscillation. That is the textbook definition of story laundering.
It absolutely is. The initial, frankly, ludicrous context, the vegetarian magazine, the non-existent reporters, gets completely lost in translation and republication. The focus shifts entirely to the purported scientific results from Moscow. The story now appeared to have been validated by rigorous, if conveniently opaque, Soviet-era scientific testing, granting it this powerful veneer of legitimacy that it absolutely had not earned.
And once it had that scientific veneer, that polished, laundered packaging, it was perfectly prepared for global popularization in the Western world, particularly in the burgeoning ancient astronaut scene of the 1970s.
Indeed. This laundered version was enthusiastically adopted by the single most influential figure in popular ancient astronaut theories at the time, Erich von Däniken.
Of course,
Yeah.
Chariots of the Gods.
Exactly. He featured the Dropa Stones story prominently in his subsequent best-selling books, notably Return to the Stars in 1970 and later in Gold of the Gods. Von Däniken cited the Sputnik article naturally, never mentioning the initial German fringe source. This cemented the Dropa Stones as an undeniable staple of ufological literature for generations and successfully obscured its highly absurd origins for decades.
The story is now famous. It's been reported, laundered, canonized by the biggest name in the field. So we now move into the forensic destruction of the hoax, the deconstruction of the fictional protagonists and institutions. If these people and places were real, they would have left a clear historical paper trail, especially in a place like China. What did historical inquiries actually find regarding the supposed lead archaeologist, Ji Pute?
Well, researchers, proper historians, and journalists have conducted extensive inquiries into the academic and archaeological records of the period in China. The conclusion is uniform and stark. There is no clear evidence, and frankly, no record whatsoever of any archaeologist named Chi Pute or the variant Ki Putai ever existing or leading any kind of official expedition in the 1930s.
He's just not there.
He simply does not appear in any archival history of Chinese archaeology, no university staff lists, no governmental expedition permits from that era. He's a ghost because he likely never existed.
And Professor Tsum Nui, the martyr, the brilliant translator who cracked the code and died in exile. The fabrication is even more definitive here, isn't it? Because the name itself is suspicious.
Sum. Nui is a complete fabrication right down to the name itself. Academic researchers, particularly linguists, immediately noted that the name Sum, Nui, is not even a real Chinese name. It doesn't follow standard phonetic patterns or spelling conventions for Chinese names.
That's a pretty big giveaway.
It is. Some later proponents, realizing this severe flaw, tried to sort of salvage the story by suggesting, well, maybe it was a former Japanese name, which only further complicates its historical credibility and makes it sound even more like an ad hoc excuse.
But the core fact remains. Like Chi Pute, he left absolutely no academic footprint, Japanese or Chinese.
Exactly. There is zero record of this person, no birth certificate found, no university graduation records, no staff appointments at any academic institution in Beijing or elsewhere, and certainly no official obituary that's ever been located in Japan or China, despite the story claiming he died there shortly after arriving.
And what about the official backing he supposedly had? The institutions that first employed him and then tried to suppress him? The Beijing Academy of this or that?
They were also fabricated, seemingly just to support the narrative. There is zero record of his alleged academic journal, where he supposedly published the controversial translation, and zero record of the alleged institutions themselves, the Academy of Prehistory, or the Beijing Academy for Ancient Studies, as they are named in the lore. The source material for the debunking concludes pretty definitively that these entities were simply made from whole cloth, constructed purely as plot devices to make the story sound official.
Let's discuss the critical significance of this complete lack of a paper trail. No field notes, no university records, no publications, no institutional records. Believers often interpret this absence as missing evidence, proof that the conspiracy was incredibly thorough. But in a proper historical context, what does this total negative actually prove?
Right. In a true historical or archaeological context, especially dealing with state-level institutions or major academic figures, this kind of total negative is positive proof of fabrication. Think about it. In a state like China, even in the mid-20th century, records of major academic institutions, official expeditions, and senior professors are generally quite meticulous and centrally maintained, even if access is difficult.
So finding nothing is significant.
Hugely significant. When an entire expedition leader, a renowned professor, a central state academic institution, and a paradigm-shifting published academic paper, all central to a supposedly world-changing claim, leave absolutely no verifiable trace in any historical record, means they almost certainly never existed. The absence of documentation here is not proof of suppression. It is proof of invention.
Okay, so if the archaeologists and the professor are fictional constructs, what about the discs themselves? They must have existed in some form, maybe misidentified, for the hoax to persist this long. This moves us now to the trail of the vanishing discs. This is where the narrative has to adapt in real time to the awkward fact that the discs could never actually be produced or found.
This stage really shows the legend's survival strategy in action. The evolving narrative of the disk's location and status is a textbook example of how a conspiracy theory adapts to explain away its own lack of physical proof. And this process happened in two distinct, verifiable stages, involving claimed sightings and then claimed destruction.
Okay, stage one, around 1974, involves an Austrian engineer named Ernst Wiegerer, who claimed to have visited China and actually obtained some form of photographic proof.
Yes, Wiegerer, sometimes his name is spelled Wegener, claimed to have visited the Banpo Museum in Xi'an. This is a real museum. and he claimed he managed to take photographs of two of the Dropa discs, which he alleged were being kept there, perhaps in storage or a back room.
Okay, photographic proof sounds promising.
Well, here's the catch. His proof was conveniently insufficient. He claimed the crucial hieroglyphs, the spiral grooves, could not be seen clearly in his photos because they were somehow hidden by the flash from his camera. And he also added that the discs themselves seemed to have deteriorated significantly over time.
The perfect alibi for bad or inconclusive evidence.
Exactly. It creates a piece of evidence that is tantalizingly obscured, just ambiguous enough to suggest a massive mystery that the viewer is invited to believe in, but crucially, too poor in quality to allow for any definitive analysis or verification of the existence of the supposed spiral hieroglyphs. It keeps the mystery alive without requiring actual verifiable proof.
Okay, fast forward 20 years later to 1994. The narrative had to evolve further when a German proponent of the story, Hartwig Hausdorff, visited the same Bonpo Museum, only to find the discs were definitely not on display and seemingly nowhere to be found.
Right. Hausdorff and his colleague Peter Krasa were faced with the reality that the discs, photographed poorly by Uyghur 20 years earlier, were now completely gone. Hausdorff's dramatic version of this encounter claims that the museum director at the time, a Professor Wang Zizhen, who was a real person, initially denied the discs' existence entirely, claiming they were just a Western fabrication or myth.
But then comes the dramatic admission, which is needed to save the narrative from collapsing.
It did, according to Hausdorff. He claimed that after he showed Professor Wang Uyghur's poor-quality 1974 photos, the director allegedly changed his story dramatically. He supposedly admitted, perhaps nervously, that the discs were real, but that his superiors in the government had ordered them destroyed some time ago, and that the museum now officially does not recognize their existence.
So the evidence went from obscured to destroyed. That's a much more absolute form of conspiracy, making verification impossible.
Precisely. The goalposts have been moved completely. And to make the conspiracy seem even tighter, there was an even more dramatic version of the vanishing witness trope that arose from this 1994 encounter, or shortly after.
What was that?
An even wilder account, circulated by proponents, claimed that the previous museum director, the one who supposedly allowed Uyghur to take the photos back in 1974, was suddenly called away or transferred just days after Hausdorff's inquiries in 1994 and supposedly has vanished since that.
Wow. Convenient.
Extremely. So this two-step process, from obscured evidence in 74 to destroyed evidence confirmed by a nervous official in 94, possibly supported by a vanishing witness, is the ultimate demonstration of how the legend proactively adapts to its own non-verifiability, constantly escalating the conspiracy to explain the lack of proof.
But the true smoking gun, the definitive proof that exposes the mundane reality behind the entire hoax, lies ironically in the only physical evidence ever offered: Uyghurs' low-resolution 1974 photograph themselves.
This is where the actual forensic investigation, not the mythologizing, pays off. Researchers who took the time to actually analyze those famous blurry 1974 photos despite their poor quality identified the objects depicted. They are not mysterious granite discs with unknown spiral hieroglyphs. They are quite clearly identifiable as well-known Chinese archaeological artifacts.
Bi discs.
Bi discs, BI.
Yes, BI discs. The only physical proof ever offered by the story's proponents, therefore, actually reveals the mundane, well-documented, and entirely terrestrial Chinese artifact that sits at the very heart of the entire misidentification and hoax. The photos debunk the myth they were supposed to support.
That transition leads us directly into distinguishing fact from fiction clearly for our listeners. The hoax isn't just an isolated lie. It seems to be a brilliant, or maybe just muddled, pastiche composite of real but totally unrelated Chinese and Tibetan elements, twisted just enough to sound fantastical. Let's start with the name. Who are the alien Dropa, really? Right, the alien Dropa tribe, described in the myth as these dwarfish beings with large heads, is almost certainly a clear phonetic co-opting, or perhaps just a slight misspelling or misunderstanding of a real, well-documented human population group, the Drokpa.
Drokpa, D-R-O-K-P-A. What is the reality of the Drokpa people?
The Drokpa are fully human, real people living today. The term Drokpa is Tibetan for people of the solitudes, or more simply, nomads. They are traditionally semi-nomadic herders who inhabit the vast, high-altitude pastures of the Tibetan Plateau, including areas near the Bayankara Ula Mountains. Anthropologically, they are of regular height, certainly not pygmy, and are a fully human population group.
So not aliens.
Definitely not alien.
Oh,
And
no.
the Chinese government, of course, has no official record of a tribe called Dropa because the name is simply a mangled version of Drokpa, likely picked up inaccurately by early proponents of the story.
So, the perpetrators of the hoax, or maybe just the confused originators, took a real nomadic group, slightly misspelled their name, and turned them into stranded alien survivors. And what about the Ham or Kam tribe, the supposed savage persecutors in the legend who killed the Draba?
That almost certainly refers to Kham, which is a real historical region of eastern Tibet, and its inhabitants, the Khampa.
Hmm.
The Khampa people traditionally have a reputation in the region for being fierce, independent warriors.
Ah.
So the hoax creators likely exploited this existing reputation to cast them as the violent, primitive savages who brutally murdered the peaceful, technologically advanced Dropa aliens. So the entire dramatic scenario is likely fabricated by taking two real Tibetan nomadic groups, inventing a violent confrontation between them based on stereotypes, and then falsely claiming the victim group was alien.
Okay, utterly cynical if deliberate. Now for the artifacts themselves. The Dropa Stones, described as these 12,000-year-old granite discs with embedded hieroglyphs, are actually a confused description of what real artifact? You said B discs?
Yes, they are a confused and significantly mangled description of a major, well-known, and widely studied Chinese artifact, the Bai disc. These are circular ancient Chinese artifacts, typically flat, with a distinctive hole in the center, matching the alleged physical dimensions of the Dropa stones perfectly.
But the material, the age, and the context are all fundamentally wrong in the hoax version. Let's clarify those crucial differences for the listener.
Okay, the material difference is huge. The Dropa stones are claimed to be granite or some mysterious metallic stone compound. Real Bai discs are overwhelmingly made of jade, specifically the mineral nephrite, though they can also sometimes be found in other materials like marble or even glass in later periods. Jade is chemically and physically nothing like granite.
Not at all. And the age difference is just staggering.
It is. The Dropa discs were claimed to be 12,000 years old, placing them firmly back in the Pleistocene era, the Ice Age. The earliest verifiable Bai discs date back to the Chinese Neolithic period, specifically the Langzhou culture, which flourished around 3400 to 2250 BCE.
So they're ancient, but nowhere near 12,000 years old.
Absolutely. They are incredibly ancient, thousands of years old, but they are nowhere near 12,000 years old. They are thousands of years too young to fit the Dropa timeline.
And their archaeological context, the reason they were supposedly found in graves in this story, is that also borrowed from the reality of Bai discs.
Yes, that detail is actually accurate, ironically. Bai discs are famously found in burial contexts, particularly in elite tombs from the Neolithic through the Han Dynasty. They are especially common in Shaanxi province, which is where the Bampo Museum, where Uyghur claim to see the Dropa stones, is located.
And what was their purpose?
Bai discs were important ritual objects, often placed with the deceased, perhaps symbolizing the sky, heaven, status, or maybe the journey of the soul. The hoax creators simply took the real context, jade discs found in ancient graves, and overlaid the fictional elements of alien technology, extreme age, and granite material.
That brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, the famous speaking grooves, the spiral hieroglyphs. We are moving into the final section, the spiral grooves and cargo cult science. If the artifacts are just jade Bai discs, where did the idea of the continuous spiral hieroglyphs possibly come from? Bai discs aren't usually covered in writing, are they?
That's correct. While the earliest Neolithic Bai discs are often quite plain and undecorated, Bai discs from later major historical periods, like the Warring States period or the Han Dynasty, are famously covered in ornate raised carvings. And the key design feature that almost certainly provided the visual inspiration for the hoax is a very common decorative motif found on these later Bai.
Which is?
It's a specific, dense, spiral grain pattern, often covering the entire surface. Archaeologically, it's sometimes known as the Gubi pattern or grain pattern. It consists of small, repeating spirals or comma-shapes arranged in rows.
So the visual impression of a spiraling, complex, almost text-like pattern was directly inspired by a perfectly normal, decorative, and repetitive green pattern carved into the surface of real jade Bai discs.
Precisely. That Gubi grain pattern provides the undoubted inspiration for the fictional spiral grooves and tiny hieroglyphs that could supposedly only be seen under a magnifying glass. The hoax relies on taking a real, ornate aesthetic feature from later Bai discs, exaggerating its function from decoration to writing, misidentifying the material, jade granite, and overlaying a fictional alien purpose onto it.
Okay, now we need to circle back to those supposedly scientific claims that Vyacheslav Zaitsev added in the Sputnik article, the findings from Moscow that gave the story its veneer of credibility. We need to fully disintegrate these claims now, exposing them as pure scientific nonsense.
Right. The scientific claims added by Zaitsev simply fall apart entirely under any basic scientific scrutiny, which brings us squarely to this concept of cargo cult science. Zaitsev claimed that granite disks, an igneous rock, which is generally a very good electrical insulator, that contained high cobalt content could somehow function as electrical conductors.
And hum.
And when agitated on a special turntable, could hum or oscillate rhythmically as if electrically charged.
Why is that statement scientifically impossible on its face?
Well, first, as I said, granite is a terrible conductor of electricity. It's an insulator. Claiming it acts as an electrical conductor is like saying a block of wood or a ceramic plate can carry a current effectively. It fundamentally cannot. Second, cobalt is a metallic element, yes, but it is not typically found in high concentrations within granite formations naturally.
Sure.
Even if it were somehow present, its presence wouldn't magically turn the entire granite disk into a conductor that could store charge and hum, like some kind of capacitor or electrically charged device. The entire claim is a geological and physical impossibility, just scientific-sounding gibberish.
And this impossibility, this use of jargon without meaning, defines the technique used to maintain the hoax's credibility among the lay public, right? This cargo cult science.
It perfectly defines cargo cult science. This is the practice of using scientific-sounding words. Cobalt, electrical conductors, oscillation rhythm, high concentrations parroted back to an audience, but entirely devoid of actual scientific meaning or context in the way they're used. The only purpose of this jargon is to impress a non-expert audience, make the story sound like it has rigorous backing, and inject a false sense of legitimacy into a narrative that otherwise relies solely on fantasy and borrowed tropes. It sounds authoritative, so people might stop asking the difficult, basic scientific questions.
The conclusion is, therefore, absolutely definitive. The Dropa Stones are not a real archaeological or historical discovery.
They are not. They are accurately described as purported pseudo-archaeological artifacts that sit right at the center of a well-documented, traceable mid-20th century hoax. Extensive inquiries over decades have found no credible record of the stones ever being authentically displayed or tested, nor any verifiable record of the existence of any person allegedly involved in their discovery or translation, from the archaeologist Chi Pu Te to the martyred Professor Sum Nui. The entire story appears to be a made-up thing with no academic or scientific proof that originated in an entirely non-credible fringe context.
Yet despite all this, the persistence of this legend is undeniable. It keeps popping up. As we wrap up this deep dive, let's just quickly review the construction of this perfect hoax again. Why has it sustained itself so powerfully, even after being repeatedly and thoroughly debunked?
It really comes down to the sheer architectural genius, perhaps accidental, of the fictional framework. First, it offers a mysterious origin, located in a remote, inaccessible lost world setting in the Tibetan borderlands, making verification difficult. Second, it provided the necessary psychological safety valve with the suppressed prophet, the disgraced Sum Nui. This ensures that any challenges to the story, any lack of evidence, are immediately reframed by believers as proof of persecution by the dogmatic establishment.
Then there is the built-in narrative that cleverly explains the lack of physical evidence over time.
Exactly. Third, the grand cover-up narrative evolved, where the physical absence of the artifacts is explained first by them being hidden, then obscured in photos, and finally by them being deliberately destroyed by shadowy authorities, possibly involving vanishing witnesses. The non-existence of the proof becomes the evidence of the conspiracy's success. And finally, you have that tantalizing but ultimately useless evidence, those few poor-quality photographs that are just ambiguous enough to allow believers to project their hopes onto them, but too poor to ever allow genuine verification or refutation based on the images alone.
So the search for the Dropa Stones doesn't lead us to a museum vault or a hidden archive. The story itself is the artifact we end up studying.
Absolutely. The Dropa Stones truly exist not as granite discs in a cave, but as a powerful piece of modern folklore, an urban myth, a persistent meme. The real sociological puzzle here isn't about ancient aliens. It's about why this specific story continues to resonate and spread so effectively, despite the overwhelming paper trail pointing back to a fictional report in a 1962 German vegetarian magazine.
It speaks to a shared, perhaps profound, cultural hunger, doesn't it? A desire for something more.
I think it does. The hoax is so successful because it taps into and fulfills a powerful, maybe even primal desire, a desire to dramatically alter our understanding of ancient human history and, fundamentally, our place in the cosmos. It answers that huge human question, are we alone? With a sensational, suppressed, and incredibly dramatic no. This potent blend of deliberate or accidental folklore, wild speculation, and built-in mystery ensures its survival, far outstripping the mundane, if still historically interesting reality of the Drachpa nomads and their beautiful but entirely terrestrial jade-by discs.
An incredible alien crash story that was really just, at its core, a bad photocopy of a jade decoration pattern, attributed to a fictional reporter working for a fake news agency, amplified by a Soviet propaganda machine, before being embraced wholeheartedly by popular ufology. That is the true strange anatomy of the Dropa Stones hoax.
And that, for you listening, is the deepest truth we could find behind one of history's most persistent and captivating alien myths.
Thank you for joining us on the deep dive. We hope this has given you some powerful insight into how modern myths are created, laundered, and persist, and perhaps made you think twice about the source material for the next great historical secret you encounter online. Until next time, keep digging.